Hi, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to take some time to talk about a few tips and tricks that you'll want to think about as you are delivering presentations. These tricks are originally kind of designed for face-to-face or in-person presentations, but we're also going to talk a little bit about how the strategies can work in a virtual environment as well. Um, at this point, you just delivered your mini presentations where you took some time to introduce yourself to the rest of your classmates. I really did appreciate the presentations and getting a chance to learn a little more about you. And I do think that as we watched the presentations, we saw plenty of good things that we can build upon in terms of speech delivery. And of course, we saw some other things that we can still be working on, and some things that you may not have thought of before, but now we'll be able to think of after we kind of work through some of this lecture. Okay, so take some time to watch through these lecture slides, and also, of course, make sure that you are keeping up with the reading. Your textbook chapters 12, 13, and 14 are all based on public speaking and dig into some of these issues regarding speech delivery as well. So to follow through the lecture slides, you'll notice that what I really want to kind of talk about first involves delivery and paralinguistics, or things that you do with your voice. Then involves delivery and kinesics, or body language, so things you do with your body. And then the third part, probably where we'll actually spend most of our time, involves delivery and the use of visual aids. You are not required to use a visual aid for your informational speech. A big part of that is kind of related to this virtual environment that we're in. But these tips and tricks that we're going to talk about in this presentation hopefully are still really valuable to you and are things that you can think about when you are giving presentations outside of class. All right, so that is the format that we'll follow. And so let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, so first I mentioned that I want to talk to you about delivery in terms of paralinguistics, right? On this slide, what I'm really trying to call your attention to is that when you are thinking about things that you are doing with your voice, I encourage you, at least initially, to just simply think about what can I do to eliminate any kind of things that would distract the audience. That's a really good place to start. Once you feel comfortable with that, then you can move on to be thinking about, well, what else can I do with my voice that can actually really enhance my presentation or make it more engaging? So the slide is really kind of trying to show you that, interesting that I just used an right, as I get ready to talk about vocal fillers, is that in order to eliminate distractions, these are some of the things that you want to try to remove from your delivery, right? And vocal fillers are something that most of us struggle with. You can see that certainly it's something I struggle with as well. When we're talking about vocal fillers, what I mean are things like ums, uhs, likes, or any of those types of like non-fluencies that we might add in between our words or our phrases. A lot of times the reason we do this is because we're anxious and we're nervous, and specifically we're worried that we don't know what we want to say next. We're trying to think about what we want to say next. So to be honest, one of the very best ways to reduce vocal fillers is simply to practice, to make sure that you know what you're getting ready to say. In addition to that, a lot of research suggests that simply becoming more aware of your use of vocal fillers can go a long way in helping to get rid of them. So if you're practicing in advance and you're going back and you're watching your speech and you're noticing that you're saying just having that on your mind and just knowing that it's something that you do actually can lead you to do it less in the future. Often I also tell my students that another really good strategy is when you are writing your note cards for your presentation to keep in mind that nobody else is going to see those, right? You're not sharing those with anyone else, so you can write whatever you want on your note cards. So one thing you could write would be try to avoid ums or do not say That simple reminder, that little bit of an awareness can actually really help to reduce vocal fillers. The last piece that I would say about vocal fillers is to remind you of something we said earlier, and that is about the power of silence. I think as Americans in general, we have a culture that does not value silence, but especially when we are in front of people speaking, we really are anxious about silence. We feel like if there is a pause in our voice, then it makes us look unprepared, or it just really gives us a lot of anxiety. But as we mentioned previously, the reality is, as a public speaker, silence can be really powerful, and your audience can really appreciate it. So another strategy for reducing vocal fillers is simply trying to think, Okay, I'm not going to replace my or my like with anything, except I'm going to try not to say it, and instead I'm just going to pause. That silence can really be a good thing for your audience. Okay, so those are just a couple of things to think about in order to try to reduce vocal fillers. Additionally, some problems that we have when it comes to paralinguistics have to do with pace, or the rate at which we speak. Personally, I tend to talk pretty quickly. I'm sure you've noticed. So I have a problem with too quick of a pace, right? Some people talk a little bit too slowly. I don't know that that's kind of as common of a problem, but pace is certainly something we should be thinking about when we're thinking about paralinguistic cues. In general, we know that people tend to speak roughly 150 words per minute when they are reading books or they're recording a presentation. So that's kind of an ideal pace. If we're talking too fast or faster than that, it can be hard for our audience to listen. If we're talking slower than that, it can be hard for the audience to continue to pay attention. So a few things you can do to help you ensure that you have a solid pace is to record yourself speaking for about 1 minute or for a certain amount of time and see how many words you spoke, right? And see if it fits in with that guideline. If you are saying way more than that, then you need to think about how you can slow down. Okay? The strategy that most of us use is to take our speech and to record the whole thing and to figure out, did we fit within the time constraints? And then either speed up or slow down. That is not a particularly effective strategy, right? Instead, if you find that you are covering way too much information too quickly, then you need to think about instead changing your pace, right, and slowing down. Or if you have the problem of talking for too long, then you may need to think about cutting information out, right, not just speeding up your pace. Again, if you're using note cards in your presentation, remember, no one else will see those but you, so another strategy you can use is to remind yourself to slow down or to pause or whatever cue you might need to help you make sure you manage an appropriate pace. Monotony or not changing the inflection in your voice can sometimes be another paralinguistic problem that we have. If that is the case for you, then you really want to think about how can you make your voice sound more conversational in tone. We typically think of questions ending with our voice going up, so you can think about that. We also think of declarative statements with our voice going down, so you can think about how to try to make sure to do that and make sure that your voice is going up or down in a way that matches the content of what you're trying to say. Finally, awkward pauses can be a problem, but as I've already mentioned, in general, we don't pause enough. We don't have enough silence. So I encourage you to kind of think about making sure that if there is a silence or if there is a pause, to not panic, to not try to fill it with something, but instead just take a deep breath and continue on. Ultimately, all of these things that we're talking about here can be addressed with things like simple awareness, realizing what you're doing, practice, we've talked about the importance of practice earlier, and those reminders or those cues to yourself to try to work on whatever vocal cue you might be struggling with. Okay, so those are just a few things to think about in terms of paralinguistic cues. Check your textbook for some additional ideas. Now let me move on to some of the body language or the proxemics types of cues or kinesics types of cues. So when it comes to kinesics, there are three kind of main things that we can think about. I see here that I'm covering up one of them. I thought I could move my camera, but I don't think I can. Okay, but anyway, when we think of kinesics, we think of our posture, our gestures, and our facial expressions. Those are really all part of body movement. We know that certain postures convey certain messages, right? You want to convey confidence and you want to appear credible. So the best thing to do that is to have a posture where you are straight, standing straight up, where you are avoiding crossing your arms, where you're avoiding crossing your legs or swaying, right? You're also avoiding fidgeting, right? When it comes to gestures, again, it's important to try to avoid crossing arms, fidgeting. One thing I mentioned previously, I think, was that it's also a good idea to avoid any of those adapters or anything that might tempt you to engage in that adaptive behavior. So what I mean by that is avoid wearing a shirt that has drawstrings, or avoid having change in your pockets. If you find yourself sticking your hands in your pockets and jingling that, right? Avoid wearing a big bangly bracelet. If you notice that sometimes you fidget with it. As we've discussed previously, a lot of the things you do pregame before you speak can make a big difference during your presentation. So those are some things to think about in terms of your posture and your gestures. When it comes to using effective gestures, a few things to keep in mind. In general, it's a good idea to kind of stay within the frame of your body, your shoulders. We know if people kind of have very small gestures, kind of meek gestures, then we think of them as being nervous or intimidated or anxious. On the other hand, if people find themselves using these great big old gestures, then it feels like they're yelling at us, right? They're controlling air traffic. So think about using gestures that stay kind of within the frame of your body. Also, we know, just like with our voice, when our gestures go up, it's usually because we are asking a question. When our gestures go down, it's more because of a declarative sentence. I will not raise taxes. Right? So think about how you might use your gestures as a way to reinforce what you are saying. I have here this picture or this image called the speaker's triangle. Your book doesn't really mention this too much, but it's a really useful tool, especially if you find yourself being particularly nervous or having trouble with avoiding the distracting parts of posture and gesture. It's hard for me to demonstrate as I'm in my office and I'm kind of sitting here, but the speaker's triangle suggests that a good strategy involves starting at the middle of your audience. If you were up on the stage or if you were in front of a classroom or a boardroom, kind of start in the middle of that space and deliver your introduction, hopefully gain your audience's attention. But then as you begin to talk about your first main point, if you're engaging in the speaker's triangle, what you should do then is walk to kind of one side of the room. Think of it as like the point, the bottom point of a triangle. When you're transitioning and you're talking about how you're moving to the next point, but you're also physically moving to that point in the room, it's very helpful for the audience to know, okay, she's moving on. She's moving to the next part of her speech. At that point, you're ready to talk about your second main point. You talk about that, you deliver your speech and all those supporting evidence related with that topic. But then when you're ready to move on to the next point, then do that physically as well, right? You tell your audience, I'm moving on to my next point, and now I'm moving to this other kind of point of the triangle or other part of the room. It's a very helpful cue for your audience. Talk about that point, cover all of your supporting evidence, and then as you're wrapping that point up and telling your audience, okay, now I'm moving on, maybe either to finish the speech or to the next point, then you moved back to kind of the center of the room. So essentially you are making this triangle physically at the same time as you are transitioning throughout your presentation. I'm not suggesting that you sway or that you pace or that you kind of frantically move back and forth, but making this very kind of deliberate triangle or movement as you are speaking is a really powerful strategy. Something to think about, again, not just because it can be a successful part of a speech, but also, again, because it can really help you maybe eliminate some of the distracting things that you might be doing otherwise. The last thing that you cannot see very well because my video is in the way, but the last part of kinesics there is facial expressions. And of course, one of the biggest parts of that has to do with eye contact. Students often have a lot of questions about how to make eye contact. And again, I know that it's particularly challenging in a virtual environment, but I encourage you to do the best you can with that, to think about possibly putting Post-it notes on your laptop or your computer to help you kind of know where to look. Right? To certainly avoid putting too much on any kind of note card or writing prompt. I think today a few folks, maybe due to anxiety, have been like reading through a presentation. And as an audience member, you can tell when that's happening, right? And so one way to avoid reading or avoid not making enough eye contact is simply not give yourself that option. If you have your entire speech written out, you're going to read it. Right? Because you're going to be nervous, anxiety is going to kick in, and if it's there for you, you're going to take advantage of it. So don't give yourself that cheat, right? Don't provide yourself that crutch. If you only have keywords written on your note cards and you don't have the opportunity to read, then you're going to be forced to make more eye contact. Okay, so that's something certainly to think about to help increase the amount of eye contact that you're making. Okay. All right, again, those are just a few things to think about. Still make sure you're keeping up with the reading. Your book offers some additional suggestions. All right, one more thing I want to talk about before we get into technology is just the sheer fact that there are a whole host of different types of visual aids that you could consider. Your book provides a really good description of each of these types of visual aids on page 359, 360. And I know you may be thinking, well, I already know what a object is. You know, I know what a diagram is. Sure, of course you do. But I think what your book does a great job of is it talks about when you might choose one visual aid over another visual aid. And so I encourage you to take a look, right? There are certain times when a pie chart is the best way to display your information, and other times when it just simply won't work and you really need to choose a line chart instead. And so if you don't already feel comfortable about knowing how to pick a visual aid, then again, look very closely about page 359, page 360. Okay. All right. So the remainder of the presentation that I want to talk about here is thinking about how to use electronic visual aids. Very specifically, I want to talk about how to use PowerPoint. My experience tells me that we are all pretty familiar with PowerPoint, and we certainly are all very familiar with a bad PowerPoint. We have all sat through crummy PowerPoint presentations. You can see that example on the left there. We've seen it. We've all witnessed this displayed in front of us, and we all know it simply doesn't work. Part of me always asks then, well, why do we keep doing it, right? If we hate being an audience member to that kind of slide, then why are we so guilty of creating those slides ourselves? And I think the simple answer is, well, just because it's easy. It's a quick and easy way to create a PowerPoint slide, right? This slide over here takes a lot more work, but it's worth it. We know that it's much more effective. So one thing that I think is interesting to think about when it comes to PowerPoint is the kind of the history behind PowerPoint. PowerPoint now is like decades old, right? It's really an old technology. When it was originally created, it was created to really kind of replace the overhead projector and those like plastic slides. You guys probably don't even know what those are, right? And so when we had only that to rely on, it made sense that we had to have, a big bullet point and sub bullet points, and that's really all we could do. But now here we are, and we are decades later, and we have all different types of technology and mediums at our disposal. We can use sound, and we can use pictures, and we can use videos, and we can do so much more than simply bullet points. And PowerPoint now has the technology and the capacity to do so much more. So it's important that we don't get lazy and we don't just rely on this old format, but instead we really utilize the technology to its fullest. So I want to talk a little more about how to do that. Okay. Again, this slide just points out that we are all guilty, regardless of discipline, of using just this basic bullet point and then sub bullet point format. Although we're all guilty of it, it just really does not work, right? And that's what's going on here in this bar chart. So this study looked at a classroom environment where students were given the same content, but the format was varied. All right. And so, so what we can see here is that these students, they were all in a like a mechanics class, and specifically they were all presented with some information about transmissions and how to repair a transmission, right? And so some of the students were only given text or written directions about this about the transmission. Some of the students were only given a speech, and so their instructor just stood up and talked to them, and that was all they heard. And then some of the students were given both the text and the speech about the transmission. And what we can see here is that when the content was delivered simultaneously through text and speech, audience comprehension was reduced, right? You can see these bars are lower than when the audience or the students heard the information or saw the information just through text, and certainly when they heard the information just through speech. The blue and the red lines represent two different tests. The blue test was a functional test, which basically means the students had to actually go out and work on the transmission and actually fix it. The multiple choice test, well, you guys know what that is, right? But we can see, when students had to both listen and read about the transmissions, they did not fare that well on the exams, right? And so you may be thinking, well, why is that? What's going on there? What we know is that the same part of the brain that has to listen and process information that way is also has to read and process information that way. So I think that's what's happening, right? When we are asking our brain to both listen and to read, what do, right? Think about what you do in that situation. You tune out, right? Or at the very best, you pick one or the other. You choose to listen but not read the slides or the text, or you choose to read but you're really not listening, right? Our brains just simply can't accomplish both those tasks at the same time. So as a speaker, what that tells us is it's really not helpful. In fact, it's beyond not helpful. It's problematic to try to present our audiences with both text and speech at the same time. So we need to think differently about that. All right, so I'm going to introduce you to a new way to structure your PowerPoint slides. This process is called the Assertion Evidence Structure, or AES. And I think it's a really powerful format to try to improve your slides. I challenge you to use this the next time you do have to present some PowerPoint slides for a presentation. So here we have two different slides. Again, we have a situation where the information is about this is the same, right? But here we have a slide that's very traditional, main point, subpoint. And then here we have a slide that uses the assertion evidence structure, which I'm going to pick it apart here in a minute and tell you exactly how it's implementing that strategy. But for now, what I want you to see is that in this situation, when students were either presented with the basic traditional format or the assertion evidence structure, and then tested over that later, what we have found is that students do better when they're presented with the info in this way. Okay, students are able to understand the material better and remember it better when they present the information this way. So again, as a speaker, that's exactly what you want for your audience, right? So this can really be a handy way of organizing a PowerPoint slide, a much more effective way. So here's just another slide that's saying the same thing, right? Again, when students were presented with the assertion evidence model, they did better on the exam that followed. Okay, so now how do you do that? How do you set up PowerPoint slides that do not give your audience a headache and do not bore them to tears or distract them? Well, if you want to follow the assertion evidence structure slide layout, there are 4 main characteristics that you need to try to follow. The first one may seem a little counterintuitive, but I think that it can be super helpful, super strategic. So the first characteristic of AES is that headings should actually be sentences, declarative sentences. Okay, we're going to talk about that a little bit more here in a moment. The second strategy is that all blocks of text should be no more than 3 lines. We'll also cover that a little bit more. Slides should really rely on visual evidence rather than words. So anytime you can use a picture, a chart, a graph, you should be doing that instead of just text. And then the last one is that you should really use very little animation, if any. Okay, so those are the main characteristics of how to use the assertion evidence structure, but let's look at them in a little bit more detail. So here is a slide that does use kind of a picture, right, or a chart, right? But let me kind of edit it up for you, and let me actually apply the assertion evidence structure and show you what it would look like if we actually applied those 4 characteristics I just discussed. Okay, here we go. All right, so in this slide, it's pretty minor techniques or minor switches here, but they're important ones, right? So if we go back and we look at this, well, let me go back. Let's see here. Okay, well, I guess because I'm recording, I can't go back. But if you recall, in the previous slide, it just simply said sales performance, but it didn't really tell the audience what they should specifically be getting out of the slide and where to look. Here you can see I've included a specific declarative sentence. Eastern region has shown steady growth in sales performance across quarters. And in addition to that, I actually drew your attention to the Eastern region, right? So as a speaker, my job is not to use PowerPoint as a crutch or as a set of notes to help me remember what I'm supposed to say. Instead, my job is to use PowerPoint to help you as the audience know what you need to get from each slide. And if there's nothing you need to get from that slide, then I don't need that slide, right? So by making this slight tweak and applying the AES model, you can see here that I'm telling you this is the main idea you should get from the slide, and then I'm helping you see it, right? Rather than relying on you to figure out what to look for. Okay. Again, I know that it's a little counterintuitive to use an entire sentence as a PowerPoint slide heading, but it's so helpful. I think sometimes we're guilty of using questions for our PowerPoint slides. Right? I think one of my previous slides said something like, what are the colors of diamonds? Well, I don't know about you, but when I go back and look at notes that I have taken, and if I just had that kind of question, then it's really not that useful for me. But instead, if the slide says something like, there are 4 colors of diamonds, then I know, okay, that's what I'm ready for. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I need to remember, right? And so as a speaker, we can really help our audience know what is the key takeaway message that we want them to remember. Coming up with sentences for the headings of your PowerPoint slides, it's a little harder than it may seem. You can't have a paragraph up there, right? It has to be a short, clear, and concise sentence. You can't have multiple sentences. It has to, again, be one main idea. But it's really worth it. Think of it this way. If as the speaker, you don't know what the main idea you're trying to get across is, how will your audience ever know what the main idea is? Okay. That's really, really important. Again, I know that it takes a lot more work than just plopping up a big, heading and then some subheadings, but to be effective, it's really, really crucial. You should always be asking yourself, what is the main idea that I'm trying to accomplish, at this moment or in this slide? Okay. Let's see here. Before we do this activity, let me just say, a couple of additional things. When it comes to assertion evidence structure, in addition to just using that sentence as a heading, you also, as I mentioned, really want to avoid big blocks of text, right? That was one of the characteristics. If you find yourself struggling to always use pictures, hopefully you're using as much visual as possible, but if you find yourself struggling with that, another tip that can help you is you should never use more than 6 words across and 6 words down. So if your slide has more than 36 words on it, you've got a problem, right? Instead, think about how can you reduce the text, and even better, how can you change the text into a picture or into a visual? I hope that if you go back and look at my slides in general, but certainly if you go back and look at my slides in this particular presentation, you will see good modeling of the assertion evidence structure. Right? Go back and look through each one of these, and you may not have realized what I was doing throughout the presentation, but now that you're aware of this technique, hopefully you can see how it was working, and hopefully you can also say, oh yeah, that was helpful. There were a lot of key ideas there that stuck, and then I'm going to be able to maybe understand and remember better than if she had just simply used bullet points and headings in that way. Okay, but the last thing that I want to show you here is hopefully to really prove my point on the power of trying this assertion evidence structure rather than just the bullet point structure is to encourage you just kind of look at this slide here. And probably you've been looking at it for a while I've been talking here. And now let me ask you a question. What letter was right below the A, the square that had the A on it? I don't know if you are able to answer that or not, but think about that. Let's see if you remember which letter was below the A. Okay, well now let's try this. Again, I'm kind of in the way here, but I've changed my slide. Rather than just having the old slide, I've now applied the assertion evidence structure model, and I've provided you with a declarative sentence as the heading, as well as a graphic to help convey my point. Now the slide says, please focus on the lower letter Q in the right-hand corner. Okay, now let me ask you, what letter was above the Q? My hope is it's a no-brainer, and now you're easily able to say, well, I know, it was X, right? And again, unfortunately, because I'm recording, I can't go back to prove it to you either way, right? But little tweaks like that can make a huge difference for your audience, right? Don't ever forget that as a speaker, you get to tell your audience what to focus on. You want to try to avoid having them focus on distracting or unnecessary info, and you want to try to encourage them to focus on exactly what your message is. And we do that either through our nonverbals, like our paralinguistic cues or our proxemics, or we can do that through our visual aids, for example, our PowerPoints. All right, so I'm right at a minute here, and I hope that, or excuse me, I'm right at 30 minutes here, and I hope that the presentation is one that you will take time to listen to, and that has some tips and some tricks that you can use as you are thinking about preparing your informational speeches and how to best deliver those. In addition to that, because we are in this weird virtual environment, I just want to take a few more minutes to talk about that, right? We may be presenting things virtually more and more these days, right? I don't know that it's going to be something that's behind us just because we think we might be kind of on the other side of this pandemic. I think that it might be kind of here to stay. So in order to think about presenting virtually, you really do kind of have to think about things differently and tweak them. One thing that I definitely want you to do is to watch the video that I've posted on our Canvas page. We have one of the most well-known experts talking about how to present virtually right now, and he is super engaging and super interesting, and he's full of ideas and things to think about that are very practical to help make a big difference when you might be presenting virtually. His ideas are not just for classroom presentations, but I think they can also really come in handy if you find yourself in meetings in the future as part of your work environment, or maybe even before you get to there are things you can think about perhaps if you are getting ready to do some interviews for graduate school or for some kind of employment. Okay. Very quickly, a few suggestions that I want to offer are, and maybe some things that I saw earlier today with our mini presentations, include things like, first of all, you do really want to think about the environment that you were in. And I know sometimes that can be quite challenging. You do have jobs, you do have pets, you have those types of things that sometimes just are gonna be there. But when possible, think about the environment that you're in. Think about if there is anything distracting in your background, and if so, can you change locations or can you use a virtual environment? In general, plainer is better. You often don't want to have just this plain, totally blank white screen behind you. It can kind of look like a mugshot if you do that. But otherwise, a bookshelf or something relatively kind of neutral is always a good idea. You can see from the image I have there, you also want to think about exactly where your camera is placed and test it out in advance, right? You want to kind of avoid the up the nostrils shot, right? You also, though, want to try to avoid like cutting off your head or cutting off other parts of your face. Okay, think about that. And of course, you also still need to be thinking about exactly what you were wearing, right? I would strongly encourage you to avoid wearing hats. It's already kind of hard to see people's eyes when they have a hat on, but especially when you're in a video, it's very hard to see your eyes, and it's very difficult for the audience to make eye contact with you. It also may not always be the most professional piece of attire. So I recommend no hats when you're presenting virtually. Right? And you may also want to think about what you're wearing in terms of making sure at least, the part that the audience can see is professional, right? Avoiding things like pajama pants or pajama shirts or even hoodies or that kind of thing. Those are some things to think about. Let's see, at this point I'm rambling, I know, just a little bit here, but a couple other things to think about. I am sitting down right now, and to be honest, I typically sit when I'm presenting, but you might want to think about standing. Sometimes it makes us more conversational and more natural. So you can put your phone or your laptop in a place where you might be able to stand, and that might lead to more natural hand gestures. Right? So think about trying that as a possibility. Excuse me. You may also want to think a little bit about, sorry, I'm continuing to use vocal fillers. You may want to think about the lighting that's in your room, and if it is bright enough or if it is too dark. And you may also want to think about some things that you can put around your computer screen. Again, if you struggle with eye contact, there's no reason why you can't put a picture of someone right behind your computer, someone that you feel really comfortable talking to, and pretend that like you were talking to them when you are presenting, right? If anything, presenting virtually gives your audience a lot more distractions and opportunities to multitask, but presenting virtually also allows you to kind of create a lot more cheats that your audience may not know that you're utilizing to help you kind of with some of the delivery things that might be harder for you face to face. Okay, anyway, at this point, I am over a half an hour, so I am going to stop. I do have that video for you regarding some additional strategies to present virtually, so I'm going to kind of leave it to him to share those with you, but I'll stop now. Make sure you watch the video and make sure you're continuing to work on the modules this week. If you have any questions for me for any of the other additional assignments that are going on, don't hesitate to reach out, send me an email, and I'll try and get back to you. All right, guys, thanks a lot. I will see you soon.